At 2:10 p.m. on the 4th of October 1943, Lieutenant Ken Wheels Walsh found himself in a nightmare of his own making, 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands. His Vought F-4U Corsair, a beast of a fighter known for its inverted gull wings and brutal speed, was surrounded, not by one, not by two, but by three Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters that had just peeled away from a larger formation to deal with the lone American who had foolishly tried to break up their attack on a group of Marine Dauntless dive bombers. Walsh was 26 years old, a former enlisted pilot who had earned his wings through sheer force of will. He had 5 confirmed kills painted below his cockpit. He was about to need a miracle to avoid becoming a 6th statistic on someone else's aircraft. The Zero was a legend. With its lightweight airframe, paper-thin skin, and phenomenal maneuverability, it could turn inside any American fighter in the theater. Its turning radius was a third tighter than the Corsair's. In a classic horizontal turning fight, the Zero's pilot, if he was even marginally competent, owned the sky. American doctrine was explicit: never ever try to turn with a Zero. Walsh had just broken that cardinal rule. The first Zero had latched onto his tail. The second was cutting across the circle to intercept his turn. The third was positioning itself above, ready to dive. The G-forces were crushing Walsh into his seat, his vision tunneling as he hauled back on the stick, trying to tighten his turn to get his guns on the lead Zero. It was useless. The Corsair, for all its power, was a heavyweight. It bled energy in a turn, its airspeed bleeding away, making it a slower, fatter target with every second. He could hear the frantic voice of his wingman, Lieutenant Jerry "Jug" Jones, crackling over the radio, distant and distorted. "Wheels! Brake! Brake now! You can't win this!" But it was too late. To brake now, to roll out and dive, would present the perfect deflection shot for the Zero on his tail. He was trapped in a turning circle of death, and he was losing. Through the sweat stinging his eyes and the gray haze at the edge of his vision, Walsh saw his airspeed indicator unwinding. 180 knots. 170. 160. The Corsair was on the verge of a high-speed stall. In seconds, it would shudder, its nose would drop, and it would become a stationary target for 3 sets of 20mm cannons. Standard procedure was to firewall the throttle, use the Corsair's massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine to power out of the turn. But that took time, and time was a luxury he didn't have. The lead Zero was already beginning to pull lead, its wings sparkling with the first flashes of its guns. In that fraction of a second, a crazy, suicidal, utterly unorthodox idea flashed in Walsh's mind. It was a theory, something he'd mulled over during long, boring patrols. It violated every tenet of aviation physics he'd ever been taught. What if you made the turn tighter by killing the engine? The logic was counterintuitive, a pilot's heresy. An engine provided power, stability, but Walsh was thinking about drag. The Corsair's huge, 4-bladed propeller was like a barn door, creating immense drag, especially at high angles of attack in a turn. That drag was what was slowing him down, widening his turn radius. Without that drag, there was no time to think, only to act. His left hand, almost of its own volition, snapped the mixture control to idle cutoff. He pulled the throttle to idle and killed the ignition. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The roar of the 2,000 horsepower radial engine died, replaced by a sudden, eerie, deafening silence. The massive propeller, now a dead windmilling disc, became the source of immense drag for a single second, and then, as it slowed, the drag lessened dramatically. Freed from the torque and drag of the powerful engine, the Corsair's nose snapped inward as if pulled by a rubber band. The turn radius, impossibly, tightened by nearly 40%. It was no longer a graceful banking turn. It was a vicious, pivoting lurch. The lead Zero pilot, who had been calmly tracking his shot, saw the Corsair's propeller stop and the American fighter seemingly break the laws of physics, jerking inward. His perfectly calculated burst of cannon fire sliced through empty air where Walsh's aircraft should have been. For a breathtaking 2 seconds, Walsh was flying a glider. A very heavy, very unstable glider that was now turning inside the nimble Zero. He was no longer the prey. He was the predator who had just done the impossible. He stomped on the right rudder, sliding the Corsair's tail around, and for one perfect, fleeting moment, the lead Zero filled his gun sight. He didn't need the engine. He was a rock in a slingshot. His right thumb pressed down on the trigger. The 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns in his wings erupted, their sound a deafening, ripping snarl even over the wind rush. Tracers converged on the Zero's fragile fuselage. The aircraft didn't explode. It disintegrated, coming apart in a cloud of shattered wood, fabric, and metal. One down. But the maneuver had cost him everything. His airspeed had plummeted to near stall. He was a sitting duck for the other two Zeros, and his engine was dead. He was now flying a 14,000-pound brick, with two very angry Japanese pilots about to make him pay for their comrade's death. Silence. That was the first and most terrifying thing. The absence of the R-2800's thunderous roar was a physical void, a pressure on Ken Walsh's eardrums. The only sounds were the shriek of wind over his canopy and the frantic, ragged sound of his own breathing inside his oxygen mask. His Corsair, the Jolly Roger, was now a 14,000-pound glider, and it was bleeding altitude fast. The two remaining Zero pilots, momentarily stunned by their leader's sudden vaporization, now saw their chance. The American was dead in the air, a victory handed to them. They rolled in, one from high and left, the other from low and right, a classic pincer movement. Their wings began to sparkle with gunfire. Walsh's training screamed at him. "Restart! Restart now!" The procedure was drilled into every pilot. Mixture rich, throttle cracked, ignition on. But his instincts, honed by 100 combat missions, screamed louder. A restart would take precious seconds he didn't have. The engine would cough, sputter, and finally catch, but in that time, the Zeros would have him. His dead engine trick had bought him one kill. Now he had to weaponize the glide. He shoved the control stick forward, trading the little altitude he had for airspeed. The Corsair's nose dropped, and the wind scream intensified. The Zero pilots, expecting him to try to climb or restart, overshot their initial firing passes. Cannon shells ripped through the air, above and behind his canopy. He was in a dive now, but a controlled one. Without engine torque, the Corsair was a different aircraft. It was nimble, lighter on the controls. The drag from the stationary propeller was still there, but it was predictable. He could feel the airframe in a way he never could with the engine hammering away. He was no longer fighting the power plant. He was one with the airframe. The Zero on his high left dove to follow. This was his moment. Walsh waited until the Zero committed to its dive, then he hauled back on the stick with all his strength, pulling the Corsair into a steep climbing turn to the right a chandelle. It was a maneuver that should have been impossible at his speed, a surefire way to stall. But without the engine's weight and drag trying to pull the nose down, the big fighter obeyed. It muscled its way up, its momentum carrying it through the turn. The Zero pilot, trapped in his own high-speed dive, couldn't match the radius. He tried to pull up to follow, but his own engine's power worked against him, widening his turn. For a second, he flashed through Walsh's windscreen, a perfect, slow-moving target. Walsh didn't have the power to bring his nose to bear. But he had enough control to slide. He stomped on the left rudder, skidding the Corsair sideways, and fired a snapshot. It wasn't a sustained burst, just a half-second blast from his 650s. He didn't see the rounds connect, but he saw the Zero's port wing fold upward like a piece of origami. The fighter snapped into an uncontrollable spin, trailing smoke and debris as it corkscrewed toward the jungle below. 2 down, but the effort had bled off the last of his airspeed. The Corsair shuddered. The native WWII, on the cusp of a stall. He was hanging, almost motionless, a mere 12,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. The third and final Zero saw its opportunity. This pilot was smarter, more patient. He didn't dive. He positioned himself behind and below Walsh's struggling aircraft, in the Corsair's blind spot. He was setting up for the killing blow, a steady, climbing shot into the unprotected belly of the gliding fighter. Walsh's wingman, Jug Jones, was still on the radio, his voice a desperate crackle. "Wheels, he's at your 6 low. I can't get to him. Restart. For God's sake, restart." Walsh's eyes darted across his panel. The altimeter was unwinding. 11,500 feet. 11,400. He was a duck in a shooting gallery. He had one last card to play, the most desperate gamble of all. He couldn't outturn the Zero now. He couldn't outrun it. So he decided to outfall it. He pushed the stick forward again, but this time he didn't just dive. He rolled the Corsair completely inverted. The world flipped. The blue ocean was now his sky, the endless blue sky his ocean. The G-forces tried to pull him out of his seat, his harness digging into his shoulders. Blood rushed to his head. Then he pulled back on the stick. Inverted, pulling back on the stick made the nose drop toward the sea. The Corsair, now flying upside down, entered a near vertical dive. It was a split S maneuver, but started from an inverted, powerless glide. It was a violent, disorienting maneuver that no flight manual would ever recommend. The Zero pilot was completely baffled. The Corsair had just fallen out of the sky, backwards. By the time he processed what had happened and rolled to follow, Walsh had built up a tremendous amount of speed in his inverted dive. Walsh watched the altimeter spin wildly. 10,000 feet. 9,000. The ocean rushed up to meet him. He waited, his hand hovering over the ignition switch, his heart pounding in his throat. He was counting on the Zero pilot's discipline, or lack thereof. He was betting the Japanese pilot would assume he was trying to escape in a dive and would follow him down. He was right. A glance in his rearview mirror showed the Zero, a small, dark shape peeling off after him. Perfect. At 8,000 feet, Walsh rolled the Corsair upright. The force slammed him down into his seat. He was now in a pure, engineless power dive. The airspeed indicator needle was pushing past 350 knots. The Zero, though lighter, couldn't match the sheer weight of the Corsair in a straight-down dive. The American fighter was pulling away. Now. It had to be now. His left hand moved in a blur. Mixture, rich, throttle, open 1/3, ignition, on. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The wind screamed. The Zero was still diving behind him, its pilot undoubtedly confused as to why the American wasn't pulling out. Then, a cough, a sputter, a belch of black smoke from the exhaust stacks. Another cough. The propeller jerked, then turned once, twice. With a world-shaking roar, that was the most beautiful sound Ken Walsh had ever heard, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp exploded back to life. Power surged back into the airframe. The controls, which had been heavy and mushy, became crisp and responsive. He was no longer a glider. He was a Corsair, again. And he was no longer the prey. He pulled back on the stick, the G's crushing him, the wings groaning in protest. The Corsair leveled out of its dive a mere 2,000 feet above the waves. He immediately rolled into a climbing turn, looking for his pursuer. The Zero pilot, shocked by the sudden resurrection of the American fighter, tried to pull out of his own dive. But he had committed too deeply. Walsh saw the Zero level out, low and slow, right in front of him. It was almost too easy. Walsh lined up the pipper on the Zero's cockpit and held the trigger down. The 6.50 calibers walked a line of destruction from the Zero's tail to its engine. The fighter shuddered, then flew apart, its pieces scattering across the ocean's surface. 3 down. Silence returned, but this time it was the silence of victory, broken only by the steady, powerful rumble of his own engine. Ken Walsh, alone and against impossible odds, had just used a dead engine to outthink, outmaneuver, and destroy 3 of the most agile fighters in the world. He keyed his mic, his voice surprisingly calm. "Jug, this is Wheels. You still up there?" A long pause, then a stunned reply. "Yeah, Wheels, I'm here. What in God's name was that?" Walsh took a deep breath, looking out at the vast empty sky around him. "That, Jug?" he said. a slow grin spreading across his face. Was a new trick. The flight back to Henderson Field was a solitary, surreal journey. The thunder of the R-2800, usually a comforting presence, now felt like a stranger's voice after the profound silence of the glide. Ken Walsh's hands were steady on the controls, but his mind was replaying the engagement in a frantic, disjointed loop. The kill, the glide, the inverted dive, the resurrection. It felt less like a memory and more like a dream, something that couldn't possibly have happened. He landed at Henderson as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the battered coral runway. The ground crew swarmed the Jolly Roger, their usual banter absent. They saw the empty ammunition boxes, the oil streaking back from the gun ports. They knew the aircraft had been in a fight, but they also saw something else in Walsh's face, a look that was part exhaustion, part shell shock, and part something else they couldn't quite place. His wingman, Jerry Jug Jones, was waiting for him on the hard stand, his own Corsair still being refueled. He pulled off his helmet, his face a mask of bewildered awe. "Wheels," he began, his voice low. I saw it, but I don't believe it. You killed your engine, you were a goddamn rock, and you turned inside them." Walsh just nodded, unstrapping his harness. "It worked, Jug. That's all that matters." But that wasn't all that mattered. The debriefing in the sweltering operations tent was where the real battle began. The intelligence officer, a fresh-faced captain named Miller, listened patiently as Walsh described the engagement. He noted the 3 kills, bringing Walsh's total to 8, making him an ace twice over. But when Walsh described the method, the deliberate engine kill, the officer's pen stopped moving. "Let me get this straight, Lieutenant," Miller said, his tone carefully neutral. "You are stating that you intentionally shut down your engine in the middle of a turning engagement with 3 enemy aircraft." "That's correct, sir," Walsh said. "And you believe this maneuver is what allowed you to achieve these kills." "I don't believe it, sir. I know it. It killed the drag from the prop." The nose snapped right around. Captain Miller leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen on the table. "Lieutenant, that runs contrary to every tactical doctrine we have. It's in the manual. You never under any circumstances sacrifice your energy and power in a dogfight. What you're describing sounds less like a tactic and more like a desperate stunt that, through incredible luck, did not result in your death." The skepticism was a physical force in the tent. Other pilots who had gathered to hear the account of the triple kill shifted uncomfortably. They had seen Walsh return. They knew he was a good pilot. But this was heresy. "It wasn't luck, Captain," Walsh insisted, his temper beginning to fray. "It was physics. The engine and prop are the heaviest, draggiest parts of the plane. Take them out of the equation in a turn, and the plane gets lighter and tighter. For a few seconds, at least." "For a few seconds," Miller repeated, his voice dripping with doubt. "And then you're a glider. A target. What if there had been a 4th zero? What if your engine hadn't restarted? We'd be writing a letter to your mother right now, Lieutenant, not debriefing a triple kill." The conversation circled this strain for another 10 minutes. The official report would credit Walsh with 3 kills. It would not mention the method. The tactic was too dangerous, too unproven, too radical to be endorsed by the Marine Corps. It was officially labeled as a 1-in-a-million event, anomaly not to be repeated, but you can't unring a bell. The other pilots in VMF 124 had heard the story. They had seen the proof painted on the side of Walsh's aircraft. In the privacy of their tents, over warm beer and cans of Spam, they argued about it. "He's crazy," one pilot muttered. "You cut your engine, you're dead. Simple as that." "But he's not dead," another countered. "He got 3 of them." 3! How many of us have gotten 3 in a single engagement? "He got lucky." You don't get lucky 3 times in a row against zeros. The squadron commander, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, had been listening to the debate from his corner cot. Boyington was a legend in the making, a brilliant, unorthodox, and often insubordinate pilot who valued results over regulations. He stood up, silencing the room. "You're all missing the point," Boynton said, his voice a low growl. "Wheels isn't saying you should cut your engine every time. He's saying that when you're in a hopeless situation, trapped in a turn you can't win, you have one last option. An option the Japs will never see coming. He's saying the manual is wrong." He walked over to Walsh, who was quietly cleaning his sidearm. "Wheels, can you teach it?" Walsh looked up, surprised. "Teach it, sir?" "The glide. The feel of it. The restart procedure. Can you teach it to the others? Not as a primary tactic. As a last-ditch Hail Mary play, the thing you do when you're already dead if you don't." Walsh thought about the terrifying silence, the delicate control inputs, the absolute faith required. It wasn't just a procedure, it was a state of mind. "I can try, sir." That was all Boynton needed to hear. The next day, he authorized special maneuvering practice for the squadron's most experienced pilots, away from the prying eyes of the intelligence officers. Over the safety of the open ocean, Walsh began to teach his impossible trick. The first lesson was the restart. They practiced it over and over until it was muscle memory. Mixture, throttle, ignition. A 3-second drill that had to be perfect. Then came the gliding turns. They'd climb to 20,000 feet, a safe altitude for mistakes. Walsh would have them kill the engine and practice gentle turns, feeling how the aircraft responded without power. The first few attempts were clumsy, terrifying. Pilots fought the controls, their instincts screaming at them to restart. But slowly, they began to feel it. The lighter touch, the way the nose would tuck in. They practiced the snap turn, the violent engine-off tightening that Walsh had used for his first kill. They practiced the inverted dive and recovery. It was dangerous, nerve-shredding work. One pilot misjudged his altitude and had to restart just 1,000 feet above the waves, his engine coughing to life with a sound that sounded more like a prayer than machinery. But they learned. They didn't have a name for it, they just called it Wheels' Gambit. It was a secret weapon, a shared piece of forbidden knowledge within the squadron. A week later, the secret was put to the test. Lieutenant Al Johnson, Johnny, found himself cornered by 2 zeros over Kahili. He was out of options, out of ideas. Remembering the training, his heart hammering against his ribs, he took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and killed his engine. The zero on his tail overshot, just as Walsh's had. Johnny snapped his Corsair around in a turn that shouldn't have been possible, lined up the shot, and blew the zero out of the sky. He restarted his engine and dove away from the second, which broke off in confusion. When he landed back at Henderson, he didn't say a word to the intelligence officer. He just walked over to Walsh, who was supervising an engine change, and gave a single, sharp nod. The message was clear. The trick was no longer a fluke, it was a tactic. And it was spreading. The success of Wheels' Gambit created a quiet schism within the Marine Corps fighter squadrons in the Solomons. Officially, it did not exist. The tactical manuals remained unchanged, and briefing officers continued to drone the old doctrine. Use your speed and power, never turn with a zero. Unofficially, a new, oral tradition was being passed from pilot to pilot, a secret handshake of knowledge shared in the dim light of makeshift officers' clubs and on the sweltering flight line. It was a tactic born not from a test pilot's report, but from the desperate genius of a combat pilot staring death in the face. The first and most crucial limitation was drilled into every pilot by Walsh himself. It was a trick, not a tactic. It was a single desperate card to be played when you had already lost the hand. You didn't lead with it. You ended with it. The second limitation was altitude. You needed at least 10,000 feet of air beneath you. The maneuver bled altitude at an alarming rate, and the restart was not guaranteed. Below 8,000 feet, it was considered suicide. The third was situational awareness. You had to know where every other enemy aircraft was. Killing your engine made you vulnerable to any other pilot in the fight who wasn't fixated on you. It was a duelist's move, not for a general melee. Despite these caveats, the confirmed kills stacked up. Lieutenant Johnson's success was not an isolated event. Over the next 3 months, 5 other pilots from VMF 124 used the engine kill trick to escape certain death and destroy a total of 7 more Japanese fighters. The evidence was becoming too compelling to ignore, even for high command. In January 1944, a formal report, heavily sanitized and buried in bureaucratic language, landed on the desk of a tactical analyst at the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington. The analyst, a former pilot named Commander Robert Shaw, read the dry account of unconventional energy management techniques with growing fascination. He saw through the jargon. He saw the pattern. Shaw was a believer in empirical data. He requested and received the combat film from the gun cameras of the pilots who had used the maneuver. The grainy, black and white footage was breathtaking. He watched Corsairs, seemingly doomed, suddenly go silent, pivot with impossible agility, and destroy their pursuers. The evidence was on film. It could not be dismissed as luck or pilot exaggeration. He drafted a new tactical bulletin. It was classified, distributed only to squadron commanders and senior flight instructors in the Pacific Theater. Its title was dry: Considerations for Emergency Maneuvering in F-4U and F-6F Aircraft. But its content was revolutionary. For the first time, the U.S. Navy officially acknowledged that, under specific and dire circumstances, the deliberate reduction of engine power could be used to enhance instantaneous turn performance. It was a cautious, limited endorsement, but it was an endorsement nonetheless. The heresy had become doctrine, albeit a secret, closely held one. Meanwhile, the Japanese were noticing a disturbing new pattern. Their pilots began reporting encounters with American Corsairs that seemed to defy physics. The after-action reports from the 2nd Air Fleet mentioned Corsairs executing impossibly tight, momentary turns that broke the tracking solution of their Zero pilots. At first, it was dismissed as combat stress or poor gunnery, but the reports were too consistent. A captured Japanese intelligence report, translated by Allied codebreakers in mid-1944, revealed their confusion. It read, "Some enemy pilots exhibit ability to momentarily tighten turn radius beyond known capabilities of F-4U airframe. Cause unknown. Possibly new model or field modification. Investigation ongoing." They were looking for a technical fix, a new flap setting, a lighter airframe. They never considered that the Americans had simply learned to fly their existing aircraft in a new, terrifying way. The psychological impact was significant. The Zero's one unassailable advantage, its turning circle, was no longer a guarantee of victory. A seed of doubt was planted. Back in the States, the effects filtered down to the test pilots at Naval Air Station Patuxent River. They took a Corsair up and tried it. They confirmed Walsh's discovery. Killing the engine did, in fact, reduce drag and allow for a dramatically tighter turn for a period of about 3 to 5 seconds. They wrote technical papers on the fluid dynamics of a windmilling versus a stopped propeller. They quantified what Ken Walsh had learned through instinct and desperation. This knowledge subtly influenced the next generation of naval aircraft. While the engine kill trick was a specific solution to a specific problem, the underlying principle that extreme maneuverability could be found outside of traditional power-on flight informed the design of later aircraft like the F-8F Bearcat, which was built to be exceptionally light and responsive. For Ken Walsh, the war moved on. He finished his tour, his tally of kills continuing to rise. He never again found himself in a situation that required his most famous trick. He had passed it on, and it had taken on a life of its own. He was transferred back to the United States in the summer of 1944, becoming a flight instructor. His students, fresh-faced kids who had never seen a Zero, listened with wide eyes as he taught them the standard, approved tactics. But sometimes, after hours, to the most promising ones, he would lean in and quietly say, "Now, let me tell you about something that's not in the manual." The ripple effect of his one moment of inspiration was now immeasurable. He had given American pilots a hidden weapon, one that exploited the enemy's greatest strength by turning it into a predictable weakness. He had not just saved his own life that day over the Solomons. He had provided a key that would unlock victory for dozens of other pilots in their own darkest moments. The dead engine trick was no longer his alone. It belonged to every Marine and Navy pilot who now had one last desperate chance when all hope seemed lost. Ken Walsh's war ended not with a bang, but with a transfer order. He returned to the United States in 1944, his logbook filled with combat hours and his record boasting 21 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top-ranking Marine Corps aces of the war. He was assigned as a flight instructor, trading the treacherous skies over the Solomon Islands for the predictable patterns above Naval Air Station Pensacola. He taught the official curriculum: gunnery, formation flying, the approved defensive maneuvers against the Japanese fighters depicted on the silhouette charts. He was a good instructor, patient and precise. But the most important lesson he ever taught was never in a syllabus. It was a whispered secret, passed on to a select few promising students during late-night hangar talks or on long cross-country flights. "When you're out of everything else," he'd say, his voice low, "remember, the engine is just weight and drag. But it's a trick, son, a last resort. Don't you ever forget that." The world moved on. The Corsair was retired, a beloved relic of a past war. Jet engines replaced pistons, and dogfighting tactics evolved into supersonic intercepts and missile engagements. The specific scenario that had birthed Wheels's gambit, the turning duel with a highly agile prop fighter, faded into history. Walsh himself slipped back into obscurity. He left the service, raised a family in Florida, and rarely spoke of the war. His Medal of Honor, awarded for his actions on a different, earlier mission, was his public legacy. The story of the 3 zeros and the dead engine was known only to a shrinking circle of old comrades and aviation historians. But the principle he had discovered, the concept of using system disengagement to achieve a transient, overwhelming tactical advantage, did not die. It was too powerful. It resurfaced a generation later, in the skies over Vietnam. American F-4 Phantom pilots, flying heavy, powerful jets, found themselves outturned by lighter, more nimble MiG-17 seconds and MiG-21 seconds. The old problem had returned in a new technological skin, and in classified tactical memos, a curious recommendation appeared for Phantom pilots caught in a close-in turning fight. Consider selective afterburner cancellation to reduce drag and improve instantaneous turn rate. It wasn't killing an engine, but it was the same fundamental idea. Sacrifice raw power for a fleeting moment of superior maneuverability. The ghost of Walsh's desperate trick lived on. In the modern era, the principle is embedded in the very software of fifth-generation fighters. The flight control computers of an F-22 Raptor or an F-35 Lightning II are programmed with carefree handling systems that automatically manage engine power, thrust vectoring nozzles, and control surfaces to achieve the optimal turn performance without the pilot having to consciously think about it. The pilot commands the turn, and the computer orchestrates a complex ballet of power and drag to make it happen. Ken Walsh's instinctual understanding of energy management has become an automated, digital reality. The man himself lived a long, quiet life. He died in 1998 at the age of 81. His obituary in the local paper led with his Medal of Honor and his service. It made no mention of tin cans or a specific, miraculous engagement on the 4th of October 1943. But in the archives of the Naval History and Heritage Command, in a folder marked Unconventional Tactics Pacific Theater 1943-44, there rests a faded typewritten report. It is the original, unsanitized debrief from Lieutenant Ken Walsh. The language is blunt, filled with the adrenaline of the moment. And beside it, in a clear plastic sleeve, is a strip of 35mm gun camera film. If you hold it up to the light, you can see the grainy sequence, a zero filling the frame, then the sudden, silent pivot of the Corsair, the tracers reaching out, and the Japanese fighter erupting into a cloud of debris. It is the only official, visual proof of the day a Marine pilot, out of options and out of hope, rewrote the rules of aerial combat with a flick of his wrist. The legacy of Ken Walsh is not just in the kills he scored, but in the mindset he embodied. He demonstrated that the greatest weapon a pilot possesses is not the machine itself, but an unbreakable will to find a solution where none seems to exist. He proved that sometimes, to live, you must first be willing to die, and that in the silence of a dead engine there can be the sweetest sound of all, the sound of victory snatched from the jaws of certain defeat. His story is a permanent testament to the fact that courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear. And for the pilots of VMF 124, that something else was the life of the man in the cockpit next to them, and the secret he shared to keep them alive.